like a compliment. Then, slowly, steady became dull. Useful became invisible. Dependable became embarrassing. The first comments were small enough for Margaret to survive. One morning, while she packed Emily's lunch, Richard looked at her old sweater and said, "You used to care how you looked." Margaret looked down at herself and gave him a small smile. The kind of smile women give when they are hurt, but too tired to turn the kitchen into a battlefield before breakfast. Another time, while they were getting ready for dinner with friends, Richard stood in the bedroom doorway and said, "You dress like you gave up." He said it lightly. That made it worse. Some people think cruelty becomes harmless if they say it in a casual voice. When Margaret's face changed, Richard sighed. "Don't start," he said. "I'm just being honest." Honesty became one of his favorite hiding places, as if truth and kindness could not stand in the same room. By the time Richard finally said, "Sometimes I feel like I married my housekeeper," Margaret had already trained herself not to react too quickly. She told herself he was stressed. She told herself work had been hard. She told herself men got restless around 55 and said things they did not mean. She told herself marriage had seasons, and maybe this was just one of the colder ones. Then Natalie Cross came back to town. Natalie had been Richard's college girlfriend, the old one. The one he mentioned with that careful tone people use when they want something to sound harmless because it happened a long time ago. She had recently divorced, moved back after years away, and started consulting in the same business circles Richard liked to impress. At first, Natalie was only a name Richard mentioned too often. Natalie knew a client. Natalie understood the market. Natalie had sharp instincts. Natalie knew pressure in a way most people did not. Natalie remembered the old days. Margaret noticed how Richard's voice changed when he said her name. Not much. Just enough. A little warmth. A little energy. A little color in a man who had gone gray around his own wife. Then Natalie became more than a name. She became the mirror Richard used to make Margaret feel old inside her own house. The changes did not come all at once. That was what made them dangerous. Richard started placing his phone face down on the table. Not once. Not by accident. Every time. He changed the password on his laptop and said it was because of work security. He bought new shirts and said they were for client meetings, even though Margaret had managed his dry cleaning for years and knew when a man suddenly cared about collars. He started going to the gym at 6 in the morning. Margaret wanted to be happy about that. She really did. But it is hard to feel proud when your husband comes home from the gym, smelling faintly like perfume that does not belong in any locker room. Not strong enough to accuse. Only strong enough to make her stomach tighten. Every time Margaret asked a simple question, Richard treated it like an attack. The first time she asked why Natalie was texting after 10 at night, he barely looked up. "She is an old friend," he said. The second time, he smiled at her with pity. "You are making this ugly because you feel insecure." By the third time, he did not even try to sound gentle. "Don't punish me because you stopped taking care of yourself." That sentence stayed with her. Not because it was the cruelest thing he had ever said. It stayed because of how smoothly it came out. Like he had been carrying it around for weeks. Like he had been waiting for the right moment to use it. Richard had a gift for making Margaret defend herself against wounds he caused. If she asked where he had been, she was suspicious. If she asked why he dressed differently, she was bitter. If she asked why Natalie's name appeared in every other story, she was jealous. If she cried, she was dramatic. If she went quiet, she was cold. No matter what Margaret did, Richard found a way to make her reaction the problem. Then he started using one word that would matter later. Unstable. You get unstable when you're jealous, he told her one night after she asked why he had missed Emily's parent meeting. Margaret stood across the kitchen from him and stared. She had been the one who sat with Emily's teacher. She had been the one who asked about college prep. She had been the one who drove home with a folder full of forms, while Richard claimed a late meeting had run over. But somehow, in Richard's version, he was the reasonable one. Somehow, Margaret was unstable. He began doing it in front of Emily, too. Quietly enough that every moment could be denied later. When Emily forgot a permission slip, Richard laughed and said, "Your mom worries because she has nothing else to do." Another time, when Margaret reminded Emily about a school deadline, Richard shook his head and said, "She lives through this house. That's why every little thing becomes an emergency." Emily looked uncomfortable when he said things like that. She was 16, old enough to hear disrespect, not always old enough to know what to do with it. Margaret felt herself getting smaller in rooms she had held together for years. Still, she did not confront Richard. Not really. She knew exactly what he would do. He would make the fight about her tone, her age, her jealousy, her fear. He would say Natalie was just a friend, and Margaret was humiliating herself. He would make her explain why a wife should care when her husband started glowing for another woman. So Margaret waited. Some days, she hated herself for waiting. Other days, waiting felt like the only wise thing she had left. By the time Richard's younger brother got married, Margaret already knew something was wrong. She just did not know the wedding videographer would be the first person to prove it. The wedding was held in a restored hotel ballroom, with tall windows, white flowers, and soft golden lights that made everything look warmer than it really was. That is the strange thing about weddings. For a few hours, even a dying marriage can look beautiful from across the room. Richard looked better than he had in months. Margaret noticed it before she wanted to. He wore the navy suit she had picked up from the cleaner the day before. His shoes were polished. His beard was trimmed. He checked his reflection twice before they left the house, adjusting his cuffs like a man preparing for an audience. In the car, he barely spoke to her. But the moment they walked into the reception, he changed. His shoulders lifted. His smile widened. His voice grew warmer. He moved through the room like someone had finally turned a light back on inside him. Margaret watched it happen with the quiet grief of a woman seeing proof before she was ready to admit what it meant. Then she saw Natalie. Natalie Cross stood near the bar in a dark green dress, polished but not loud, elegant but careful. She knew exactly how close to stand to the line without stepping over it in front of witnesses. Close enough for Richard to notice, not close enough for anyone else to call it shameless. Richard saw Natalie before he saw Margaret watching him, and his face changed. That was the detail Margaret would remember later. Not the flowers, not the music, not the champagne. His face. A man's face can confess before his mouth starts lying. Richard crossed the room toward Natalie with a drink in his hand and a laugh already waiting. Margaret watched him touch Natalie's arm. Then,
a few minutes later, the small of her back.
Quick touches. Smooth touches. The kind of touches people call accidental when they do not want to admit what they are seeing. During dinner, Richard sat beside Margaret, but he was not really beside her. His attention kept drifting across the room. He laughed at things Natalie said from another table. He raised his glass toward her once, like they were sharing a private joke. When Margaret asked if he wanted water, he answered without looking away from Natalie. That hurt more than it should have. Not because water mattered. Because being invisible beside your own husband is a kind of humiliation nobody else at the table can see. After the speeches, Emily called from home. She had stayed behind because she had an early school event the next morning, and she wanted to know where Margaret kept the extra phone charger. It was such an ordinary question, a mother's question. Where is the charger? Where's the permission slip? What time do I need to be there? Margaret stepped into the hallway to answer, one hand over her other ear, while music and laughter pushed through the ballroom doors behind her. She told Emily where to look. Top drawer. Left side. Behind the old tablet case. Emily found it, thanked her, and hung up. Margaret stood there for one extra second, staring at the patterned carpet under her shoes. The hallway felt calmer than the ballroom. Cooler. Quieter. Safer. Then she started back toward the reception. That was when she heard Richard's voice. He was standing near the gift table with Natalie and a few old friends. The music had dipped between songs. The videographer was nearby, adjusting his camera and checking audio before the next dance. Richard did not know the microphone was still on. He did not know the camera was still catching sound. And he did not know Margaret had stopped just outside the doorway. One of his friends said something Margaret could not quite hear. Natalie laughed softly. Then Richard lifted his glass and said, "Margaret is a frumpy housewife. She knows where the bills are, where the towels go, and what day the trash gets picked up." The men around him laughed, but not comfortably. It was the tight little laugh people give when they are not sure whether cruelty is supposed to be funny. Richard kept going. She is the safe choice. She keeps the house running. But Natalie... He paused. Not because he was ashamed, because he wanted the sentence to land. Natalie makes me feel like a man again. Margaret did not move. For 1 second, the whole room seemed to shrink around those words. The terrible part was not that they surprised her. The terrible part was that they did not. Some part of her had been hearing that same sentence for years, only quieter, in the sighs, in the comments about her clothes, in the way he smiled at his phone and went flat when he looked at her, in the way he made the life she built for him sound like the thing that had trapped him. Richard leaned closer to Natalie and added, "There comes a point where you realize dependable is just another word for dead." Natalie looked down, smiling like she was trying not to enjoy it. Margaret felt something inside her go still. Not numb. Still. Like the part of her that had spent years asking to be seen, finally sat down and stopped asking. She did not walk over. She did not slap him. She did not throw a drink. She did not give Richard the scene he would later use to prove his favorite word: unstable. Instead, Margaret looked toward the camera. The red light was on. The videographer had heard it too. His expression changed for half a second before he looked away and pretended to adjust the lens. That was when Margaret understood something cold and useful. This time, Richard's contempt had not disappeared into the air. It had landed somewhere. It had been kept. She turned around and left before anyone could see her face change. Richard found her near the coat check about 20 minutes later. "There you are," he said, as if she had wandered away from her assigned place. Margaret looked at him. His tie was slightly crooked. The same tie she had straightened for him before they left the house. "What is wrong with you?" he asked. That question almost made her laugh. Not because it was funny. Because even then, even after everything, he believed her face was the problem. "Nothing," she said. He lowered his voice. "Do not embarrass me tonight. This is my brother's wedding." Margaret glanced past him at Natalie, who was pretending not to watch. "You are right," Margaret said. "This is not the place." Relief moved across Richard's face. That relief told him more than guilt would have. He thought he had handled her. He thought her calm meant she would swallow it, the same way she had swallowed the comments, the insults, the late nights, and the little humiliations he kept calling honesty. But that night, Margaret went home before him. The house was quiet when she unlocked the door. Emily was asleep. The kitchen light hummed softly over the counters. Everything looked normal, and somehow that made the night feel even stranger. There were dishes in the drying rack, the family calendar on the fridge, Emily's sneakers by the back door, Richard's mail sitting in the wooden tray Margaret had bought years ago because he was always misplacing envelopes. A whole life sat there, acting like it had not just cracked open. Margaret went to the drawer where she kept insurance papers, old receipts, school forms, appliance manuals, and all the family documents nobody thanked her for knowing how to find. She was looking for the latest insurance statement. She did not know why at first. Maybe she needed paper. Something real. Something ordinary. Something that reminded her she was not losing her mind. Instead, behind a stack of warranty papers, she found a hotel bill folded once. Badly. Like it had been hidden by someone who assumed she would never look. Lakeview Grand Hotel. 1 suite, 2 adults, paid with a joint credit card. Margaret stared at the date. It was the same Friday Richard said he had driven out to check on his mother because her back pain had gotten worse. His mother. That was the part that made Margaret close her eyes. He had used his mother's pain as a cover. The insult at the wedding had cut her open. The hotel bill showed her what had been hiding underneath. It was not only humiliation, it was betrayal. And worse than that, it had been paid for, with money from the life she helped build. Margaret took a picture of the bill, then another. Then she placed the original inside a folder and tucked it in the back of her closet. She did not touch Richard's phone. She did not guess his passwords. She did not open anything that was not hers to access. She did not need to become reckless to become strong. She simply preserved what had been left in her own house, inside the drawer she had organized for 26 years. That night, for the first time, Margaret did not ask herself how to save her marriage. She asked herself how much truth Richard had been careless enough to leave behind. The hotel bill told Margaret that Richard had betrayed her. The back records told her that he had expected her to pay for it. That was the part that changed the shape of her pain. A marriage can survive a lot of ugly things, at least in theory. Distance, resentment, pride. Even one terrible sentence, maybe, if the person who said it understands the damage and owns what they did. But Margaret was not looking at one terrible sentence anymore. She was looking at a pattern. The next morning, she did not confront Richard. She made coffee. She packed Emily's lunch. She asked her daughter if she had remembered her chemistry notebook. She stood in the kitchen while Richard came downstairs, kissed the air near her cheek, and acted like the night before had been nothing more than a long wedding and too much champagne. That was when Margaret understood how practiced he was. Not practiced at dramatic lying, practiced at ordinary lying. That was worse. He poured coffee into the mug she had bought him for Father's Day, checked his phone, and smiled at something on the screen before turning it face down. "You were strange last night," he said. Margaret looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I was tired." Richard nodded like that explained everything. Like tired was all she was allowed to be. After he left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder she had hidden in the back of her closet. She placed the hotel bill inside. Then she began gathering only what she had a right to access. No passwords guessed. No phones searched. No accounts broken into. Just the ordinary records of an ordinary household. The records Richard had ignored because he believed the woman managing them was too dull to matter. She pulled joint bank statements, credit card statements, tax returns, mortgage records, retirement summaries, insurance notices, school emails, medical appointment logs, receipts for Emily's volleyball fees, tutoring sessions, braces, and field trips. Texts from Richard canceling pickups because he had a late meeting. Messages where he told Margaret he could not make parent-teacher conferences because work was impossible that week. Every document told a small truth. Together, they began forming a language Richard could not charm his way around. The first suspicious charge was not large. That was why it had been easy to miss. Consulting fee, $300. Then again the next month, client dinner, storage payment, NEN-C support, Cross Holdings, LLC. Margaret stared at the initials until they stopped being initials. N-C Natalie Cross. At first, Margaret thought Richard had simply been careless with affair expenses. Hotels, dinners, maybe gifts. Men like Richard often believe shame makes women too emotional to do math. But the payments were not random. They repeated. They moved in patterns. Some appeared just after Richard received commission checks. Some were listed under business categories. One transfer had been made 2 days before Richard told Margaret they needed to wait on replacing Emily's laptop because money was tight. Money was tight for his daughter, not for Natalie. That afternoon, Margaret called Clara Bennett. Clara was 61, with a voice so calm it made everyone else sound dramatic. She had been recommended by a woman Margaret knew from church. a woman who once said Clara could make a liar sweat without ever raising her voice. Margaret told her the short version. The wedding, the sentence, the hotel bill, the payments, the way Richard kept using the word unstable. Clara listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, there was a short silence on the line. Then Clara said, "Bring me what you have. Copies, not originals if you can help it. And do not warn him."
Margaret met her 2 days later in a quiet office that smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and old wood.
Clara spread the bank statements across her desk and read them with the patience of someone who understood that betrayal often hides in boring places. Not in love letters, not always in photographs. Sometimes in numbers. After a while, Clara tapped one finger against the line that said Cross Holdings, LLC. "This is not just about an affair," she said. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Clara looked up. According to what we can argue in this state, the court may care less about the affair itself than about hidden money, credibility, and how he uses your daughter in the divorce. Margaret did not answer right away. Emily. That was the word that cut through everything else. Clara leaned back. Has he talked about custody? Margaret almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because Richard had never been the kind of father who thought about custody until custody became useful. He mentioned equal time last week, Margaret said. Out of nowhere? Clara's face did not change. Then we prepare for that too. Richard's sudden interest in being a full-time father arrived exactly when Margaret began asking quieter questions about money. He came home one evening and announced that, if things ever got ugly, he would fight for 50-50 custody. He said it while standing in the kitchen, where Margaret had just finished washing Emily's lunch containers. "I am her father," he said. "You do not get to control that." Margaret looked at him. "You missed her orthodontist appointment yesterday." Richard frowned. That is not the point. It is always interesting when people say that. Usually, it means the point landed exactly where it was supposed to. Richard did not know Emily's coach's name. He did not know which medication made her nauseous. He did not know the password to the school portal. He had not signed a field trip form since middle school. He had missed the parent meeting about college prep because Natalie had needed help reviewing a proposal. But now he wanted equal time. Not because he had suddenly become present. Because someone had told him parenting time could affect child support. Margaret wanted to scream. Instead, she opened a new folder. Clara called it a parenting timeline. Who drove Emily to school? Who attended conferences? Who scheduled medical appointments? Who paid activity fees? Who stayed home when Emily had a fever? Who knew the counselor's name? Who was actually there? The work was exhausting. It was also clarifying. Margaret had spent years believing care was invisible because no one thanked her for it. But on paper, care had weight. Dates, receipts, messages, signatures. Then Clara found the medical payments. They were small at first, tucked between other charges. A clinic, a lab, a pharmacy near Natalie's apartment. Then one larger payment marked simply as support. Margaret read the name of the clinic twice before her mind allowed the meaning to settle. A prenatal center. Richard had paid medical bills connected to Natalie. Clara watched Margaret carefully. Do you know if she is pregnant? Margaret's throat went dry. No. Clara closed the folder halfway. Do not react to the pregnancy. Let him put it in writing first. That sentence stayed with Margaret all the way home. Do not react. For 26 years, Richard had counted on Margaret reacting, crying, asking, pleading, explaining, giving him the argument he needed so he could call her unstable, tired, jealous, bitter, and old. This time, she gave him nothing. For the next 3 weeks, Margaret lived 2 lives. In one life, she was still Richard's quiet wife. She made dinner. She asked Emily about school. She folded towels. She answered Richard in calm, ordinary sentences while he talked about work, gas prices, and how nobody understood pressure anymore. In the other life, Margaret worked after midnight. She scanned records at the kitchen table with the lights turned low. She labeled files by date. She sent documents to Clara. She built the parenting timeline one entry at a time. School emails, medical receipts, canceled pickups, activity payments, messages where Richard said he had to work late, dates when charges appeared near Natalie's apartment on the same nights he claimed something had come up. It was a strange kind of pain, acting normal beside a man who had already left her in every way that mattered. But there was power in it too. For the first time in years, Margaret was not asking Richard to tell the truth. She was preparing for the day when the truth would speak for itself. Richard mistook her calm for weakness. That was his mistake. One evening, while Emily was upstairs, he stood by the kitchen island and watched Margaret wipe the counter. "You know you need this house more than I do," he said. Margaret kept wiping. He waited for a reaction. She gave him none. So he pushed harder. "You do not even know how ugly divorce gets. Lawyers, money, court. You think you can handle that?" Margaret rinsed the cloth in the sink. Richard's jaw tightened. "No judge is going to take the word of an unstable housewife over mine." There it was again. Unstable housewife. 2 words he had sharpened into a cage. But Margaret was no longer living inside it. 2 days later, the wedding videographer sent the clip. The email looked harmless. He said he had pulled some candid footage from the reception and thought Margaret might want it, since Richard had been speaking near family and friends. Maybe he knew what he was sending. Maybe he did not. Margaret never asked. She opened the file alone. Richard's voice filled the kitchen. Clear, casual, cruel. There he was, glass in hand, Natalie beside him, his friends laughing because nobody wanted to be the first person to admit he had gone too far. Then came the sentence again. Margaret is a frumpy housewife. She knows where the bills are, where the towels go, and what day the trash gets picked up. The first time, the words had cut her open. The second time, they hardened something inside her. She did not cry. She watched the clip to the end, saved the original in 3 places, and sent it to Clara with one message. "This is the video." Clara replied 6 minutes later. "Save the original. Do not send it to him." The confrontation came 3 nights later. Richard came home late, smelling like restaurant wine and expensive cologne. He looked relaxed until he saw Margaret sitting at the kitchen table. The hotel bill lay in front of her, not crumpled, not waved in his face, just placed there, flat and quiet. Richard stopped. For a second, the mask slipped. Then he smiled. "You really went looking?" Margaret looked at him. "No," she said. "You left it where your wife keeps the insurance papers." His smile thinned. "It was a client situation. Two adults," Margaret said. "You do not understand how business travel works." "I understand what a suite is." Richard pulled out the chair across from her, but did not sit. He liked to stand when he wanted control. "This is exactly what I mean," he said. "You take one piece of paper and build a whole paranoid story around it." Margaret folded her hands. He leaned forward. "You are hurting Emily with this. This jealousy. This obsession with Natalie. This need to make yourself the victim. It is not healthy. There was a time when that would have worked. Margaret would have defended herself. She would have explained that she was not jealous, not paranoid, not unstable. But that woman was tired. This one was quiet for a different reason. Richard pointed at the bill. "Natalie is a friend. The hotel was for a client. The payments are business. You are making yourself look unstable." Margaret stood and slid the bill back into the folder. "Then you should have no problem explaining it under oath." For the first time that night, Richard had nothing ready. No laugh, no insult, no speech about her insecurity. Only silence. And in that silence, Margaret heard something she had not heard from him in years. Fear. Richard walked into court believing Margaret was the embarrassing wife he could explain away. He wore a dark suit, a clean shirt, and the expression of a man who had practiced looking reasonable in the mirror. Margaret sat beside Clara with a folder in her lap. She did not look at Richard for long. She did not need to. Richard's version came first. He said Margaret had become jealous and unstable. He said she was fixated on Natalie because she felt insecure about aging. He said she had taken one bad wedding comment and turned it into a campaign to destroy him. He said he wanted equal custody of Emily because he loved his daughter and wanted to be present. Clara did not interrupt. She let him build the house. Then she started removing the beams. First came the parenting records. Not speeches, not tears. Dates. The parent-teacher meeting Richard missed. The orthodontist appointment he canceled. The volleyball tournament he promised to attend and forgot. The school emails sent to Margaret because Richard never responded. The medical forms signed by Margaret. The activity fees paid from Margaret's account. The text where Richard wrote, "Can you handle Emily tonight?" Something came up. Something had come up many times, usually Natalie. The judge looked over the timeline for a long moment. Richard shifted in his seat. His attorney said work demands did not make a man a bad father. Clara agreed, calmly. Then she said, "But asking for equal parenting time only after child support becomes an issue may speak to motive." Richard's face changed. Just enough. Then Clara asked to play the video. Richard's attorney objected. He called it inflammatory. He said it was out of context. Clara did not raise her voice. She simply explained that Richard had placed Margaret's stability and credibility at issue. The video showed his own public statements, his attitude toward his wife, and the woman he claimed was only a friend.
The room went quiet when the clip began.
There was Richard at the wedding, glass in hand, Natalie beside him. His voice came through clearly on a microphone he never knew was listening. Margaret is a frumpy housewife. She knows where the bills are, where the towels go, and what day the trash gets picked up. No one moved. Then came the rest. She is the safe choice. She keeps the house running, but Natalie makes me feel like a man again. Margaret did not look down. She did not cry. She let Richard's own voice do what her tears never could have done. It made the truth audible. His attorney tried to call it wedding talk, a joke, a bad moment. Clara waited. Then she connected the video to the records. The hotel bill, the joint credit card charge, the repeated consulting fees, the apartment deposit near Natalie's address, the medical payments, the transfers to Cross Holdings LLC, the late reported commission money, the bonus routed through a small consulting arrangement instead of being fully disclosed in the marital paperwork. One document could be explained. Two could be coincidence. A dozen became a map. Clara asked why marital funds had gone to Natalie Cross. She asked why payments labeled as business lined up with hotel stays and personal expenses. She asked why Richard claimed financial strain while sending money through an LLC connected to the woman in the video. Richard answered badly. Men like him often do when charm stops working. He said Margaret misunderstood. He said Clara was twisting things. He said Natalie had been going through a difficult time. Then he made the mistake Clara had been waiting for. He mentioned the pregnancy. He said Natalie needed support because she was carrying his child. And he was only trying to do the honorable thing. For 1 second, Margaret felt the room tilt. Only 1 second. Then Clara opened another folder. The DNA test had come through the financial dispute. After Richard tried to justify the medical bills and support payments as obligations tied to a child he believed was his. The result was simple. The child was not Richard's. The silence after that was different. The video had exposed cruelty. The DNA result exposed foolishness. Natalie Cross had let Richard pay medical bills, apartment expenses, and support money, while knowing there was a serious question about paternity. Richard had used that child as an excuse to hide spending, pressure Margaret, and pretend he was starting a brave new life. Instead, he looked like a man who threw away his family to become someone else's wallet. By the end, Richard had lost the story he walked in with. He was not the reasonable husband with an unstable wife. He was the husband recorded humiliating that wife in public. He was not the devoted father fighting for his daughter. He was the father whose own record showed absence when parenting required effort, and sudden interest when child support required money. The court did not give Richard the clean escape he expected. The hidden money was brought into the marital estate. A portion of the funds spent on Natalie had to be accounted for. Child support was calculated from a fuller picture of Richard's income, not the smaller number he wanted the court to believe. Margaret remained Emily's primary residential parent. Richard received parenting time, but not the 50-50 arrangement he had tried to use as leverage. He was ordered to contribute toward attorney fees tied to the financial concealment. And the word unstable the word he had sharpened for months, lost its power in the face of records. Margaret did not win because she cried better. She won because she stopped arguing with a man who needed her emotional. She let the paper speak. She let the video speak. She let the numbers speak. And together, they said what she had been too tired to say for years. When it was over, Richard still had his expensive suit, his excuses, and his pride. But he no longer had Margaret's silence to hide behind. After the divorce, Margaret left the city with Emily. There were too many streets that still carried Richard's shadow. Too many places where she had smiled beside a man who was already building another life in his head. So they moved 2 hours away into a smaller house with old floors, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that needed work. They were not as comfortable as before, but they were peaceful. There was enough money for the bills, enough food on the table, enough quiet to sleep through the night. Next door lived Daniel Porter, a widower with kind eyes and patient hands. He first helped Margaret fix the back fence after a storm loosened it. Then he helped her turn the rough patch behind the house into something living. Tomatoes came first, then beans, then herbs, then peppers. Emily laughed at the crooked rows and said their garden looked like it had been planted by people still learning how to stand up straight. Maybe she was right. After a while, that little backyard became a small farm. Not the kind that makes people rich. The kind that makes people tired in a clean way. The kind that puts dirt under your nails, vegetables on the table, and peace in the house. Daniel did not make speeches about saving them. He just showed up. A repaired fence, a basket of tomatoes, a steady chair at dinner, a hand on Margaret's shoulder when the old fear came back for no reason. Slowly, the house next door became family. Richard's life fell apart quietly. The financial mess followed him back to work. The court record, the hidden payments, the questions around Cross Holdings LLC, and the DNA embarrassment did not stay as private as he hoped. He lost his job. Then Natalie left. The woman who made him feel alive disappeared when the money and status disappeared. After that, Richard started calling. At first, he asked to speak to Emily. Then he demanded. Then he begged. Emily refused most of his calls. One afternoon, she finally answered. Margaret stood across the kitchen, pretending not to listen. Richard spoke for less than a minute before Emily's face changed. Not angry, tired. Then she said, "You were my father, but you stopped acting like one. I already have someone here who loves this family better." She ended the call and placed the phone on the table. Margaret opened her arms. Emily stepped into them. Later, Richard called Margaret. He said he missed his family. He said he had lost everything. He said Natalie had used him. He said he did not know what he had until it was gone. There was a time when those words would have broken Margaret open. Now, they arrived too late to matter. Margaret listened quietly. Then she smiled. Not because she hated him, because she finally understood he was no longer her responsibility. She ended the call and went outside. Daniel and Emily were in the garden, pulling weeds between the tomato plants. The evening air smelled like soil and basil and something simple enough to trust. Margaret stood there and watched them, her daughter laughing, Daniel kneeling beside the plants.
The small house behind them. The life she had not planned, but somehow belonged to her.
For 26 years, Richard called her the Frumpy Housewife. In the end, he learned the truth. She was not holding him back. She was holding his life together. And when she left, she did not become rich. She became free. If this story reminded you that silence is not weakness, leave your thoughts below. And if you want more stories about betrayal, evidence, consequences, and quiet redemption, subscribe and come back for the next one.